United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy. The Chinese Red Army...
The Korean people are a strong, unified nation. They have withstood the test of time against all odds. Dynasties have come and gone along with occupational rulers, yet all that remained was the Korean spirit. As history progressed and surrounding nations grew in strength, Korea found itself at threat of Japanese imperialism. In 1910, 5 years after defeating the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan would continue to expand their sphere of influence by annexing Korea. Until the ultimate surrender of the Japanese Empire at the end of World War II, Koreans suffered from brutal subjugation. Similar to Nazi goals in Europe, the Japanese attempted to wipe a millennium of Korean culture in order to assimilate them into Japanese society. Japanese colonial authorities crushed any mere sign of dissent with an iron fist. Relief soon came to the Korean peninsula as the Japanese surrendered to Allied powers on September 2nd, 1945. Despite the surrender, weeks prior the Soviets declared war on Japan and began their march across Manchuria. In fear that the Soviets would annex Korea, the US offered a trusteeship deal in which both superpowers would control different halves of Korea. The Soviets immediately accepted, and thus the border that split Korea was placed at the 38th parallel. All seemed well for the Korean people, as both the Soviets and Americans agreed that they would unify both halves in the years to come. As time went on, the Soviets soon turned their back on the promise and focused on bolstering communistic ideals within the northern half. Meanwhile, the Americans helped create a provisional government that valued democratic and capitalist values in the southern half. By 1947, tensions began to grow between the two halves of Korea. Reunification seemed more and more like a distant thought as governmental influence increased. Eventually, the US and Soviets both agreed to pull out troops, and thus, a year later, on August 15, 1948, South Korea officially declared sovereignty. Nearly a month later, North Korea would do the same. South Korea would democratically elect Syngman Rhee as president, whereas in the north, Joseph Stalin would personally appoint Kim Il-sung as dictator.
But there was worse to come. A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed until the United Nations took its historic vote to intervene.
Nearly 2 years after gaining independence, South Korea was still weak from Japanese occupation. Supplied with the latest Soviet weaponry, North Korea saw its opportunity to reunify the peninsula. On June 25, 1950, 75,000 North Korean soldiers marched across the 38th parallel and towards Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Heavily outnumbered and ill-equipped, South Korean forces were either eliminated or forced to retreat, and thus within only 2 days the North had already captured Seoul. In reaction to the invasion, the US promptly proposed a resolution to the UN Security Council in which a US-led coalition of UN soldiers would help South Korea repel the northern invaders. The resolution passed and would mark the first time the UN would intervene in an international conflict. In total, 16 diverse countries from all around the world sent troops in order to protect South Korea from impending doom. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, whom was in charge of U.S. forces in the South Pacific during World War II, was appointed as commander of the UN coalition. After a month into the war, the North Korean war machine was still advancing. UN forces were forced to retreat until finally pushed back into the southeast corner of the peninsula near Pusan. Despite the grave circumstances, hope wasn't yet lost. General MacArthur devised a plan in which he would not only fortify their remaining friendly territory, but also plan an amphibious landing at Incheon, a coastal city near Seoul. The reason for launching this unexpected assault was to catch the North Korean infantry off guard and cut them completely off from supplies and reinforcements. The landing at Incheon proved to be a massive success, and within 2 weeks, UN forces retook Seoul. With a large portion of the North Korean army cut off and little resistance ahead, UN forces marched across the 38th parallel and into North Korea. UN forces continued to find success as they advanced north. The coalition captured Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, and kept advancing until they reached a stopping point near the Chinese border. Chinese officials feared that if North Korea were to be captured, China would be next. This led to Mao Zedong, along with other Chinese military officials, to send over 200,000 troops to push UN forces back. Chinese forces would catch UN forces off guard and would ultimately overwhelm them due to the sheer numbers. UN forces quickly retreated south past the 38th parallel and dug in. Blamed for provoking Chinese intervention, General MacArthur would soon be relieved from his command by President Truman. Now the main goal for UN forces was to simply recapture territory held by South Korea before the war, which also meant taking back Seoul, which Chinese forces captured during the UN's retreat. After regrouping and launching a series of counterattacks, the UN coalition recaptured Seoul and fortified near the 38th parallel. For the next 2 years until June 27, 1953, the war would turn into a stalemate with no major territorial advancements being made. Compromise is perhaps the best way to describe the end of the Korean War. After 2 years of inconsistent talks over armistice, a deal was finally struck on July 27, 1953. Although the armistice declared a complete cessation of all hostilities in Korea by all armed force, it didn't mean that the North and South signed a peace treaty. Instead, the armistice mainly served as a ceasefire. Still to this day, an official peace treaty has yet to be signed. The armistice brought an end to the mass brutality of war seen on the peninsula, collectively killing over 2.7 million civilians as well as 2 million soldiers. Besides bringing the end of the war, one of the biggest products of the Korean armistice was the creation of the Demilitarized Zone. Spanning across the Kansas line, which was the border held by UN forces at the time, the DMZ is a 2.5-mile-wide buffer zone in which no military personnel were allowed to enter. But just outside of the DMZ lies thousands of troops on both sides, constantly keeping an eye on one another, making sure that they stay within their border. US troops are among those patrolling the DMZ due to the signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty between South Korea and the US. In order to ensure that both sides respected the armistice, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission was established, which composed mainly of Swiss and Swedish military personnel. Despite this, a stubborn North Korea would violate the armistice multiple times over the course of the coming years. Whether it be the infamous Korean axe murder of 1976 or the sinking of a South Korean corvette in 2010, North Korea has maintained a stiff disregard for the armistice. Over the past 65 years since the war ended, drastic changes have been seen in the Korean peninsula. Against all odds, South Korea has rebounded and become an economic and technological powerhouse on the global stage, although meanwhile in the north, increasing UN sanctions over human rights violations and nuclear armament has vastly crippled Kim Jong-un's regime. Outside of the peninsula, the Korean War is often dubbed the Forgotten War by Americans. This is mainly due to the fact that the Korean War was dissimilar to World War II. Unlike World War II, American society remained uninterrupted from its daily activities. It was almost as if the US wasn't even engaged in a war at all. As stated before, a compromise is the best way to describe the end of the Korean War. Neither side is bound by a peace treaty, but rather the fear of retaliation, that if either side were to attack, devastating repercussions would occur. Whether it be the bombardment of Seoul, which is home to nearly 18 million Koreans, or the toppling of Kim Jong-un's cruel dictatorship, another Korean War is the last thing the peninsula wants.